Welcome to Grandpa Dave's Diary. I believe we're on episode 5 and continuing to read out of Grandpa Dave's Diary. The last episode, we brought it up to the point where you met me in my childhood in Sacramento, California. And we were kind of leaving off the point about the warrior side of me, which has always caused me trouble in terms of being impetuous, maybe getting in some fights. It wasn't really belligerence. You wouldn't have noticed it right away. But because I was so ambivalent about it, had mixed feelings about that pushy, overt side of me, it got me in trouble at times. And much later, after we're finished the book, we're going to be talking about these different aspects of who we are, where they tend to arise in the body, where we can recognize them and deal with them. And I think you're going to get something out of that. But for right now, let's continue getting to know little Dave Morgan, David, as I was called then. And this part of me that anger is the emotion. The warrior might be the archetype or the personality, the side of my personality. But we're going to pick up where we left off with this. My first memory of overt angry rebellion is also my last, at least in childhood. I think it came in late summer of 1953, shortly after I turned 4. I'm pretty sure my parents were trying to enforce nap time, but I wasn't tired, preferring to go outside and play with my friends. Whatever it was, I clearly recall my white-hot anger and my resolve to run away from the injustice I was receiving. I think my parents laughed and responded with a classic, "Oh yeah, you can go, but just leave your shoes here." Confusing but effective. I was a quick study, and I'm sure this common childhood moment left me feeling that overt anger, no matter how just the cause, won't win the day. From that time on, all I remember are secret, hidden bits of resistance. Pooping outside and playing with matches comes to mind. Years later, after decades of repressing even righteous anger, I found a certain sadness that I was so quick to mistrust the value of expressing it in what I saw was just causes. But this story is not meant as a criticism of how Mom and Dad handled my frustration, especially since I made such a hash out of my own years as a parent in many ways. It's just that, as I said, I learned fast, and I don't remember being overtly angry at an authority figure until my days in the Army 16 years later. Sadly, choosing to bury the feisty rebel is one of the choices I made that turned me towards inward and outward self-destructive behavior. I suspect my path would have looked vastly different if I'd kept some sort of a roguish rebel alive in ways more healthy than the ones I slowly moved into. But that's just speculation, and it's fair to say that by the time I was 6 or so, my angel had almost completely shut down the notion that the devil in me had anything useful or healthy to say. It's also fair to say that the rebel did eventually emerge about 6 years later, but was often sneaky and subversive and selfish. In summary, by age 12, I was on my way to being dutiful and responsible, but emotionally unengaged with the world around me. I felt safer with sneaky rebellion than overt defiance of authority, and finally, my life's GPS was set firmly on looking for what others expected of me and defining success completely by a worldly standard. I'm going to say that again. My life's gyroscope was set firmly on looking for what others expected of me and defining success completely by a worldly standard. In other words, everything out there instead of how I was experiencing what I was experiencing inside. This just didn't matter. It was all about out there. As is true for all of us, my inner world constantly interacted with the outer one, busily creating my view of the world and my responses to it. In other words, I was building my ego identity. Just that simple and just that complex. I'll use the whole idea of social class structure as an example of how my identity in the world began to take shape. Mine was by no means a multi-ethnic childhood, but the post-World War II boom in California, as well as the war itself, diminished some of the pre-war consciousness that separated blue and white-collar folks, those with college educations and those without and the like. But even with even when economic opportunity on the increase put many blue-collar folks in the same neighborhood as white-collar folks, The type of work you did and education level you achieved were significant dividing lines for my parents. Since Dad was an ambitious blue-collar worker and Mom was a college graduate, the education subset of class distinction was apparent even with my own family. Specifically, Dad's unquestioned status as the head of the family, even with Dad's unquestioned status as the head of the family, Mom's educational achievement gave her an elevated status in his eyes. This was one of my early lessons in us and them, and seemed like a perfectly natural and immutable law of the world, as things like that seem to children. Being the immaculately perceptive child I was, I wrote all this down in my soul and improved my understanding of the innies and the outies for the next 40 years or more. Of course, there was another unwritten rule that clashed mightily with this somewhat amorphous but pervasive awareness of class differences. The people with the right kind of class had to act like we were all the same, burying any behaviors or attitudes that might seem like one-upmanship to the neighbors. This is also, as you probably know, or looking back can recognize, very American. We pretend there are no classes here, and yet, in reality, how we relate to each other and how we see the world, yes, we have class structure. It's just not as clearly defined as the old European class structures we came out of. So all very complex and confusing messages, all dutifully recorded in my growing list of how to be a good person and how to tell who were the bad ones. So class consciousness, however shifting and subtle, became a lesson in discernment. It also became a larger lesson in how to negotiate and navigate a world in which many of the signposts are submerged in a sea of both personal and cultural denial. A story from their later years brought all of this back in sharp detail to me. It starts in the early 80s when Mom and Dad went with my wife and I on a special trip to Hearst Castle, about 94 miles south of Monterey, California. The castle sits near San Simeon on an estate of something more than 80,000 acres and is a monumental testament to the ego and wealth of William Randolph Hearst, a controversial publishing tycoon of the early and middle 20th centuries, kind of like the Murdoch families are now with Fox News and everything else that they own. If you've never seen or heard about it, Hearst Castle has 165 rooms, including 56 bedrooms and 61 bathrooms, and is spread over 125 acres of pools, terraces, and gardens. One of its iconic features is a Roman pool, including an ancient Roman temple that Hearst ordered imported and installed as the pool's centerpiece. The view of the Pacific Ocean from the castle is unmatched, not to mention the miles of private coastline that is part of the estate. Every room is decorated with a pirate's treasure or the finery, elegant draperies, silver and gold fittings and fixtures, imported tiles and woodworking. The place is very much an American castle. In its heyday, the grounds even had their own zoo, the zebras of which still romp freely on the ranch. For the most part, we had a precious and memorable time, but for me, the trip provided an unexpected insight into a lifelong insecurity about money. For many reasons, some from childhood and some of my own making, money has been sticky tentacles that took a lot of time to untangle, and I still confess to some difficult moments over finances. So in this story, walking through a museum of the lifestyle of the truly richest and most famous, even from a bygone era, this all promised to bring up a lot of conflicting emotions. And it did some of that, but the more instructive lesson came with a glimpse into my mother's deepest attitudes towards wealth and the status money bestows. In brief, as I watched Mom's starstruck response to this decadent opulence of the castle, I reluctantly realized I was seeing some of my own idolization of money. The surprise was that it was coming from Mom, not from Dad, who had the ever-present issues that were dealt to him in his poverty in West Texas during the Depression. All right, with the scene set at Hearst Castle, let's go on with the trip. To begin this short but pithy saga, let me describe my mother's feat. I know, it's odd. I don't know exactly the source of the problem. My sisters claim it was Mom's vanity about the shoe size and style, but by the time Mom was in her 80s and going on this trip with us, she had severe bunions and walking was quite obviously very painful. It didn't keep her from traveling or doing anything that she wanted to do or thought she needed to do for her family, but it was hard to watch at times. In any event, by the time we took this trip, she had plenty of trouble walking, but on this trip, walk she did. There are 4 tours available for folks visiting Hearst Castle. By the time the 4 of us finished one and moved into the second one, Pam and I were physically exhausted and growing emotionally numb to this grotesque excess of the castle. Dad had seen all he wanted to as well. But the trip was primarily for Mom, so we thought she should decide, even while we hoped she was tired enough to continue on to the next leg of the trip. Instead, she was quite adamant that she'd waited 40 years to return to the castle and insisted on at least 3 of the tours, so that's what we did. 2 things amazed me about this. First, the rest of us were worn out before the second tour, so how did this petite little lady with bad feet find any desire to keep going? Second, right to the very last tarnished piece of metal in the very last room in what I considered a Soviet-style addition to the original castle, she was in childlike rapture at the surroundings. On the one hand, I'm forever pleased that we could do something for Mom that gave her such pleasure, and it did. She was thrilled. On the other hand, I hurt for her, because looking back, I believe a part of her longed for something she saw in this fairy tale opulence of the castle, and something she could have never really hoped for as a suburban mother of 5. Writing the story and remembering her awe at the glamour represented by the castle was another glimpse into Mom's conflict between her career as a housewife and her desire for something else. But something else emerged as I wrote. I'd never really considered her part of the often confusing and painful idealism that has driven much of my life. But her version of it emerged in the retelling, and it's not a stretch to think I took on her castle in the sky aspirations as my own. In other words, that was part of setting that bar so high that I could never achieve it. It's kind of like what she was doing with wealth. The only difference between us being I had my own picture of the castle, with mine consisting of things like unachievable timelines for peace on earth and goodwill towards man, things like that. They were equally glitzy goals, but more suitable for my generation of builders. So it was the same kind of dynamic at work, and I don't know if any of you have that, but setting your goals into unrealizable places and heights, it cuts you down. You're never quite satisfied with what you've done, and that has been a distinct part of my life until fairly recently. Technology obviously wasn't one of them, but perhaps by the end of this, I will get there. In addition to my overactive conscience, if you remember the man of smoke with glitzy red eyes 20 feet high from the last episode that chased me home when I was 6 years old after being a bad boy, you remember that. So in addition to my overactive conscience, or perhaps partly as a result of it, I had enormous compassion for others and was exquisitely sensitive to overt injustice and suffering. I hated it when kids made up nasty nicknames for others, and I didn't take part in that or other bullying behavior. In other words, a kind and thoughtful child. At the same time, I look back and realize my ultra-sensitivity to the sensitivity of the world and the personality I built to dull the pain was part of my preparation for the eventual disaster my life became. I think two events illustrate the conflict of my impossibly heroic pose and created a huge conflict in a young soul. The first comes in the early years of television, probably about 1956. We were watching a show on our black and white TV that Dad built into a set of beautiful redwood shelves. In the story, a young tough guy with a greased ducktail haircut and rolled-up T-shirt sleeves snuck up on a guy in a sports coat, slacks, and a jaunty tweed hat. I remember he snuck up on the guy and hit him in the back of the head with a sap. I remember my fear ratcheting up as he got close to the guy. And when he hit him, I presumed he killed him. I say presumably because right after he hit him, I ran screaming and crying into my adjoining room and didn't come out for quite a while. It was textbook terror, and I was quite simply scared out of my mind. I guess I was young enough that the violence was quite real to me, and I just couldn't accept that no one had prevented it, modest as it was by today's standards. The second event occurred in about fourth grade. It was recess, and I noticed a circle of kids gathered around two boys. I approached the group and realized that it was a bully named Sammy picking on my gentle friend Jerry. It bothered me tremendously, and I wanted to stop it, but I was worried that Sammy would turn on me if I tried. I did a swift calculation, the way that boys can do, and realized I might have a chance for survival if I followed my heroic impulse. So I confronted Sammy about his bullying. As I expected, he did come at me, but after I returned a few punches, the matter was settled without blood. My dad considered me quite the hero for standing up for Jerry. But as I contemplated this moment many years later, and several others like it over the years, a different picture came into view. My actions were not unselfish expressions of courage, but an attempt to protect myself from the very deep fears typified when I ran from the television violence. It was the same thing coming out in a different way. That's not to say Jerry wasn't thrilled to be protected or that it wasn't a good thing, but I eventually realized there was an undercurrent of self-interest here. You might almost call it selfishness in a way. Taken together, these events are a quick look at the kind of unconscious ego reasoning I developed to create my hero personality. If I could identify and conquer as many of the world's demons as possible, the illusion that I was safe and in control would keep me from the less manageable fears and conflicts within. As with any true walk towards God and spiritual understanding, this template for avoiding inner reality that eventually had to be confronted will be a central theme for the book. In other words, you can't hide from yourself. Or from your thirst. By my own reckoning, what I think of as my hero personality was pretty well in place by the time I was 6 and was well established by the age of 12. Smart, personable, and kind, I was by all outward appearances on a track for a successful life. But the inner story, the story of a restless, demanding, and often arrogant shadow personality, is the stuff I was really made of. So we're going to get into, we may not finish it, but we're going to get into the next chapter of autobiographical material, I guess you might say. It is called Preparing for Failure. The epigraph, the little bit of this that starts it out, says, "The phoenix must burn to emerge." I'm sure you're familiar with the phoenix as Fox in the Harry Potter series. Just a beautiful rendition of that mythological creature. So the phoenix must burn to emerge by Janet Finch offered that. So preparing for failure. Many of our demons take years to manifest into overt self-destruction, but I think mine probably started nipping away in early adolescence. The cultural disintegration of the late 1960s was not evident in the quiet suburb of my childhood when I entered Arden Junior High School in 1961. As with all children that age, it was my time to begin figuring out who I was going to be as an adult. Without putting words to it, I figured that the right social skills would cover a desperate, if unconscious, lack of confidence in my self-appointed position as savior of the masses. In other words, I had to find something other than being this worldly hero, or it just wasn't going to work. So I was right. Charm, good manners, and a desire to avoid conflict and please others did cover a lot of fundamental weaknesses for many years. I should add that 8th grade is the last year I remember having much interest in academic learning for the sake of curiosity until I was about 35. Another fault line in my personality for sure. So, as is true for many adolescents, popularity became the overriding goal that I took into Rio Americano High School in the fall of 1963. Along with ever-declining grades and interest, high school was filled with lots of social success. The years were crowded with many of the trappings that suggest achievement and a future alive with possibilities. class offices every year, culminating into senior class president, cute and popular girlfriends, involvement with leadership in several clubs, acting the lead in school plays, organizing dances and fundraisers. But what I didn't have was study skills, any real academic interests, or much confidence that the flimsy substance of popularity would translate into success into the real world. It all contributed to an increasing sense that my future was steadily degrading. But again, very realistic fears like that were put aside for the time being or forever, as far as I knew consciously. After all, I was mastering my role as a student leader and actor, the acting part being both literal and figurative. To bring 4 years to a quick close, whatever confidence I felt with high school success evaporated when I graduated. In short, nothing about high school prepared me for graduation and adult choices and responsibilities. Oddly, I was quite aware of the lack. I just had absolutely no idea how to fill the void or even where to locate it, and no confidence there were any answers worth pursuing. Within a year of high school, graduation, drug use, an illusion of happiness brought me my solution. It was fake, but that's just what it was. Okay, the next chapter will be called Puff the Magic Dragon. I'm sure you can figure out what that's going to be about. We'll save that for next time. As always, I hope it's interesting just to read this kind of ongoing development of a personality that led to wild success, not of my own making in the spiritual dimensions, but also a crash that will look familiar to you. I'm sure many people you've seen. I hope it hasn't happened to you. There are other ways to achieve spiritual enlightenment than going through terrible suffering. But until we see you again, I'm always happy that you're here. This is Grandpa Dave's Diary. We will see you soon.